We return to Studio 255 in the Laramie Plains Civic Center with the Talk Shop and more topics covered with respect to City of Laramie governance. In the last segment, we talked about the City Council Tuesday night, August 5th agenda. I want to encourage your attendance as citizens of Laramie to give your input on all matters concerning the City of Laramie. But specifically, you can expect that there will be great attendance for the Surface Water Management Program discussion. There are 2 items on the agenda directly related to this. Brett Glass here in Studio 255, would you briefly summarize the 2 considerations on the tomorrow night agenda?
Okay. The first one is a pause in the program. It would pause collection of the stormwater tax and supposedly allow council to reconsider some things, particularly the appeal and credit aspects of the stormwater drainage, what they're calling a utility service and program.
And with respect to the second item?
The second item is a repeal of the ordinance related to surface water
entirely.
drainage.
Do away
entirely,
with it.
Yes. Do away with it, tear it up, start from scratch.
And with respect to each of those initiatives, who authored each of those agenda items on the City Council agenda? They each denote individuals who perhaps helped directly write it. Who can we credit with respect to these initiatives?
Well, that's the interesting thing. Most of these are written, whether they're resolutions or ordinances, are written by the city manager's office and the city attorney's office. And then they're introduced, a particular council member takes responsibility for introducing it each time it's read. If it's a resolution, it only gets read once. If it's an ordinance, it gets introduced 3 times. Now, the interesting thing about Tuesday's agenda is that, the agenda always specifies who is going to introduce an ordinance. And the interesting thing about this is that the repeal is going to be introduced by Councilor Brandon Newman, but the resolution to suspend, which sort of seems like it was originally meant as a substitute for repeal, even though it really doesn't do a good enough job of that, is listed as belonging to Councilor Bowling, but also Councilor Cumby, who is the mayor. Now, that's probably a procedural error. It's probably a mistake, because the mayor in our system of government, where we don't have an elected mayor, we have what's called a weak mayor system, doesn't allow the mayor to introduce ordinances, and yet her name is on this, which probably means that, again, it's not really proper, means that she must have had a very strong hand in introducing the resolution and specifying its particulars.
One thing that is very valuable, I believe, as people go into tomorrow night's City Council meeting, if you're able to take the time to visit YouTube, take the time to examine and review the December 3rd, 2024 City of Laramie City Council meeting in its entirety or in part, but specifically related to the surface water drainage program and the discussion therein. One comment of really powerful note to me is Joe Shumway's. He makes note of a 150-year history of Laramie not paying a surface water drainage tax fee.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, he had streets and parking as 2 priorities he stated were of a higher level of importance than flooding and drainage. Though he acknowledged the importance of all, his prioritization was such that he asked a very important question on that evening. What legally substantiates council voting to adopt this fund versus the electorate. And more importantly, how we're funding it seems to be the critical step that was skipped.
Yes. Well, in 2020, the Wyoming legislature specifically authorized cities to establish a surface water drainage utility, as they called it. It's, whether it's a utility can be debated, but essentially they called it a utility. And they put it into the ordinance which authorizes cities to do things. But they left in place a requirement, and this is in Title, if you want to look it up, it's Title 16, Chapter 10 of the Wyoming statutes, that required that the way you fund it still had to be approved by the voters. There are other things that also have to be approved, but this in particular, there's actually a separate chapter that calls it out. It says it has to be approved by the voters. Also, a lot of properties in Laramie don't receive other city services. They don't have, maybe it's a parking lot. It doesn't have a water hookup. It doesn't, it doesn't need a sewer hookup. It doesn't need other things that the city provides. And so the state statute specifies that this stormwater tax is to be collected by the taxing authority. Now, what's the taxing authority? Who do we pay taxes to? Well, the county. The county treasurer, the assessor assesses your property, and also does mill levies for the city, and does that tax. The county treasurer would bill you for this. It would be on your utility bill, and so it was a great surprise to a lot of people when this popped up on your utility bill, where it didn't seem to belong. And in fact, it's probably not legal because of the state statute. It probably wasn't legal to do that at all. It probably should have been done on your property tax bill. And there's an advantage to having it on your property tax bill, because if you have a mortgage, then that is paid out of escrow over time. So your mortgage payments gradually contribute to it, and then it gets automatically paid along with everything else. You may actually be, if it's considered to be on your property tax bill, you may also get an advantage when it comes to income taxes.
Those things would benefit the citizens.
That's right. But instead, the city put it on your city utility bill, where you get none of those advantages, and again, it probably is not legal to do it.
You mentioned earlier this agenda item that was co-sponsored by Mayor Cumby. You also mentioned that in a weak mayor system versus a strong mayor system, that may not have been appropriate, certainly by your analysis, not appropriate. And my question to follow up with that regard is it time for Laramie to elect a mayor? In your estimation, what are your thoughts with respect to our current system with a city manager that's not elected, that's appointed by the city council, and the strong mayor system, which would have electorate select the leader of our city?
Well, my opinion, this is my personal opinion, is that small cities can do with a council and city manager form of government with a weak mayor. They really just have some logistics that need to be taken care of, and having the council be just a board of directors and then having having them hire a CEO to do the work, well, that works fine when you're a minor league city. But when you get to be a major league city, you really need to have an elected mayor that sets policies for the entire city. There are very few large cities, I can name only maybe one or two, that have stuck with a council and city manager form of government, and even they have moderated that more toward giving the voters more direct input into city policy. The largest one, and it has some dysfunction as a result of this that I know of, is Dallas, Texas. And they have all kinds of issues as a result of not having moved to an elected mayor. But pretty much every other major league city in the country elects their mayor.
Would you delineate it by population, total city budget? What per se would you parallel the transition from one form of government to another form, the weak form versus the strong form?
I would say when there are enough issues floating around in terms of management of the city that the public needs to directly elect the person who does it, and not just elect a council, which then basically has is told not to micromanage. That's when it's time. And Laramie has gotten to that point. We're now the third largest city in the state. We've got all kinds of issues being hurled at us internally and also outside. We also have national issues that are beginning to impinge upon our city. And Cheyenne has an elected mayor.
What's the term of office? 2 years, 4 years? What is the general trend for an elected mayor?
It varies from city to city. And there's some it also varies according to whether there's a possibility of recalling the mayor. You tend to have longer terms in cities where they have some mechanism for recalls, which really in Wyoming we don't have recall mechanisms, according to state statute for elected officials. Because of that, we might want to have shorter terms in Laramie than we do, so that, again, if we see that a mayor isn't performing, we'd have some input. So I would probably opt for either for 2-year terms or 4-year terms, so long as there was some way of holding a recall election if things went very wrong and we had a mayor that we decided we really didn't like or agree with.
So in terms of a transition, what's necessary in order to make the consideration to go this direction? Would it be a city council resolution that they outlined, whereas this, whereas that, be it resolved that we will put it to the ballot and therefore let the citizens decide on this matter as the ultimate voters?
Well, in the past, the way we've changed things about our city government involving, for example, the ward system, has always been by petition. What's happened is that some group of citizens have gotten together and stood in front of Walmart or Safeway or wherever, gathered enough signatures, and according to state law, you get enough signatures, you can put the proposition on the ballot to make the change in the city government. That's how we went from all of our city council members being elected at large to having small wards, which we did at one time, to having slightly bigger wards, which is what we have now. And same thing with electing our mayor. That's how that's probably the best way to do the change, and it's a grassroots way to do the change. And so I think that's an ideal way to accomplish it.
It seems that with sessions like the Fifth Tuesday assembly of 8 of 9 city council members, that the specific ward system truly muddies up and generalizes a more at-large representative system. It seems that each city council member more treats it more general in terms of operations of the city than specific to their wards. Is that unfair?
Well,
or an inaccurate assessment?
It's my opinion and the opinion of a lot of people that, in Laramie, that having a ward system seemed to be a good idea, but in reality doesn't really work. All of the council members vote on everything, and the city is too interconnected for most issues to apply to any one neighborhood. Also, our neighborhoods, we have a few neighborhoods that are very cohesive, and a good example is the West Side. But other areas of town aren't really that cohesive. They don't have neighborhood associations. They're not really united, And
There are
as
more
a,
densely populated
Yeah.
apartment complexes with more transient living year to year and so forth. Turnover is higher than, say, in West Laramie, for instance.
Exactly. And in general, our whole city has a large transient population. And so you don't get the chance for as much development of neighborhood character. And so having the ward system really, the way it's worked out, having a ward system really has not caused neighborhoods with strong opinions on issues to be well represented. Um, my personal opinion is that we might as well go back in order to get the best candidates, throughout the city. We might as well go back to having all the councilors sitting at large. Right now, we have no at-large candidates. And we definitely want to have, if we go to a strong mayor system, have the mayor be elected at large, of course, because that person is going to have a lot of control. We'll finally have a full-time elected person running the city from day to day in town hall, and that person obviously should be elected by everybody.
Citizen Tim Hale, in the Fifth Tuesday session just recently, pointed to the need for a strong mayor system, an elected mayor, as his point of view was it would allow, following this type of action, this type of performance, it would allow for a mayor to be elected out of office, not selected, voted out. And that was Tim Hale, longtime resident of Laramie, right here in Laramie, Wyoming. And with your observation of the Fifth Tuesday and other actions throughout 2025 or previous, what were your thoughts with that citizen's position?
Well, I really think it's time to have to have an elected mayor. Another thing that it would do, and I guess Tim's comments kind of alluded to this, is that for once we would have some checks and balances, the same way we're supposed to have anyway on the federal level. Suddenly you sort of have an executive branch and a legislative branch. You don't really have a judicial one, but you now have council as more of an independent legislative body. And it's balanced by the mayor serving as an executive. Right now, what we have is the council appointing the city manager as a CEO, and also being urged not to micromanage that. So really, we don't have any checks and balances. Really, what we mostly have is a CEO doing things and and rubber stamping by the city council. And that's one of the things I think that's hurt us. I think we need some discussion. We need a little bit of tension between multiple branches, and so it's yet another reason why I'd like to see an elected mayor system rather than the current system.
In a strong mayor system, the elected mayor, would be in charge of the city. They would be that administrator, correct?
That's correct. Basically the elected mayor in that case would be the CEO. Now, again, just as now where we have an assistant city manager, the mayor wouldn't do it alone. We would probably have a vice mayor, who again is hired by the mayor. But we'd have a little. We would have someone who is directly accountable to the people, who has to talk to you, who has to answer the phone because, well, they're going to be a candidate soon. They need to, they need to respond to you. But who is actually responsible for hiring and firing, for making day-to-day decisions, for dealing with complaints.
They would appoint department heads.
Exactly. Well. And right now, and they'd also have an incentive to keep the city government a little bit leaner than we have right now. Right now, we have sort of a diamond-shaped organizational chart in our city. We have a large tier under the city manager of middle managers, and not as many people doing the actual work probably as we should. And these middle managers are extremely well paid, but they mostly sit at their desks. And, well, management tends, it tends to serve its own interest. They will give themselves raises. They will tend to grow they'll tend to grow the city government, and they won't necessarily do it in an efficient way. If we have a mayor managing things directly, maybe we can, at election time, we can hold that person's feet to the fire and say, well, shouldn't city government be more efficient? Shouldn't we have more people directly serving the people and fewer just sitting there managing? Right now, there isn't a good mechanism for doing that unless council steps in. And again, if council stepped in and did this, they'd be chastised for micromanaging.
In 2021, I was told by one department head in the city of Laramie, Eric, I don't work for you. I work for city council. Would the strong mayor system help department heads be more responsive to the citizens themselves?
Absolutely, because at least they report to someone who's elected. Actually, that manager, if they said that to you, misspoke. That person reports to the city manager, who in turn works for city council. So they're one remove farther away from the public. And that
maybe they're so endorsed by the city manager that they took that leap of faith.
That's right. But in fact, that person was farther removed from the public and had less of an incentive to respond to whatever issue you had than if we had an elected mayor and the complaint, again, it was one remove away and the person who you complained to would be elected.
Are city staff untouchable?
Not entirely. You mentioned before Tim Hale. He raised a fuss sometime, not long ago about the police department. That's about as I remember, as I remember, a gun left in one of the city's restrooms. That created quite a fuss. So I wouldn't say that city staff is untouchable, but perhaps they're too insulated from the public.
One such example of untouchable is multiple requests by the Talk Shop for interview opportunities with various leaders in the community, in the city structure itself. And so many of those, over 90%, have gone unresponded to. Now, that is so pervasive that it seems to be an unwritten policy in the city of Laramie not to engage with media.
Well, that's an interesting point. If we have an elected mayor and there's enough of a fuss raised that any manager within the city is going to have to ask either the city's CEO before going out and making a media appearance. It's just the way organizations work. But if we have an elected mayor and we say we really want to hear from such and such a manager within the city hierarchy, the fire chief, for example, then because that person is elected and is expected to be responsive to the citizens, then that CEO would probably grant permission. Now there are so many layers that it's unlikely we could get, say, the director of public works, the planning director, any of those managers who do important things to appear in the media. And that's a concern because we'd certainly like to know where their heads are and what they're thinking, what they're doing.
Subsidized organizations like the Laramie Main Street Alliance with Executive Director Trey Sherwood exist as one entity that has been unavailable, non-responsive, entirely non-responsive, from as far back as April 2024. Immediately following the Laramie Main Street Alliance's publishing of a letter in support of the termination of the Landmark Square parking agreement that was valid on a 50-year renewable lease through 2042, I followed up with the Laramie Main Street Alliance office to seek information in detail to accurately portray what they based their decision on to support the termination of this parking area in downtown in favor of dense housing, which comprised the 3% preference for dense multi-unit housing versus single-family housing, for instance, in the core of downtown Laramie. And in the face of downtown having so many empty storefronts and businesses challenged to survive through economic times and pressures of the last 5 and 10 years, it seemed like something that was absolutely worth having a conversation going forward. To date, August 4th, 2025, no response from Executive Director or any designee, Trey Sherwood, or any designee. Now that to me is highly concerning. This is not only Executive Director for the Laramie marketing branch of our community for the city of Laramie. It's very often utilized as a marketing arm of the city, though that is a commercial competitor. The government has created, without request for proposals, mind you, the setting for government to compete with private sector, giving no opportunity to interact or benefit locally. That's an interesting piece in and of itself, but my greatest concern is the lack of responsiveness. That was almost over a year ago that we sought information following the parking issue in historic downtown Laramie with Laramie Main Street Alliance. Then subsequent to that, most recently, as far back as June, when Albany County legislators met at Laramie High School to have a town hall that was moderated by Jeff Victor and the Laramie Reporter representative, moderated that event, which was a fantastic opportunity. 5 of 6 elected legislators, Senator Crum, Rothfuss, Representative Provenza, Sherwood, and Chestick, all present, and only one absent was Ocean Andrew. And in that setting, post that actual town hall, which was about an hour and a half in length, I asked Trey Sherwood directly for the opportunity to discuss Laramie Main Street Alliance's stewardship of the WYO Theater. And I confirmed that they were stewards of that through Sherwood's response on that evening. And I requested a meeting to follow up on some ideas that I had and considerations that I wondered if might be possible. A brainstorming opportunity, if you will. And to date, June, July, now August, no response. I followed up again with this request for a meeting the week of Jubilee Days. And naturally, Laramie Brewfest, led by Laramie Main Street Alliance in later years, they had taken that event over, and I myself, for the first decade, was highly involved in helping build the Brewfest. So I understand there's a lot goes into it. It's quite busy time. But we're 3 weeks past Laramie Jubilee Days concluding. No response from Trey Sherwood. I struggle with representation and people in city and government overall, government subsidized areas that are not responsive to the public. Brett, do you have thoughts?
Well, there's a lot here to talk about. First thing that we should remember is that Laramie Main Street is a nonprofit. It's a separate organization from the city. It's a private nonprofit organization, and it's a 501c3, which means that technically it is a charity. That makes it very interesting that the city is hiring it as a fee-for-service provider to provide services to the city, in particular marketing and services and promoting downtown. 501c3s really aren't supposed to be in the business of doing anything that's normally carried on for profit. And this is really going right out to the edge of, and maybe stepping over the edge of, what it's allowed to do by the FCC rules. The IRS rules. I'm sorry. The IRS has a doctrine called the commerciality doctrine, which says that a 501c3 can't keep its status if it looks too much like a commercial entity, if it gets involved in the businesses of running a brewfest for money, if it runs farmers markets for money, if it does marketing for money, if it's a landlord for money. And so that's one of the issues here. Is Laramie Main Street, should we really be, as a city, hiring Laramie Main Street to provide fees for services? And is it stepping over the line? Should it really be that kind of a nonprofit if it seems to be mostly engaged in doing various businesses? Now, as for speaking to the public, well, as long as we do have a fee-for-service contract between the city and this organization, we can specify in the contract that it be responsive to the public in certain ways. And I don't think that the city is being diligent enough about doing that, about holding its feet to the fire and saying, well, if you're going to be our marketing organization, you need to open your meetings and publicize well when they're going to happen. You need to be responsive to the public. You need to take real polls and surveys where you really ask all of the downtown businesses what they think of particular things. So this is something where I think two areas where I think the city is falling down. If it's going to be hiring Laramie Main Street at all, it really should reconsider how it does it. Now, as for Ms. Sherwood, she is in an interesting position because she is both executive director of Laramie Main Street and a state legislator. As a legislator, she certainly should be in the media, and she certainly, just for that reason alone, should be on the air talking to constituents about what's going on in the city and also in the state level, just in general, because she's supposed to be representing us and she's supposed to be communicating with us. Now, as the executive director of Laramie Main Street, she needs to be careful about conflicts of interest. A couple of years ago, you mentioned the WYO Theater. She brought a bill to the legislature which involved subsidizing projects to rejuvenate buildings like the WYO Theater, which was donated to Laramie Main Street a few years ago by John Guthrie. And that, in my mind, was a conflict of interest. She's still supporting it now, although I think other legislators who've seen other projects that it might be useful for have taken up the torch. It's still a conflict of interest between her job as executive director of Laramie Main Street and her position as a legislator, for her to be pursuing this. And I think that is an ethical concern which should be resolved. But in any case, regardless, as a legislator, she should be on this show. She should be talking to the public. She should be, for that reason alone, she should be interacting with us. And because Laramie Main Street does have a lot of power, a lot of say over what goes on downtown, City Council listens maybe too much to Laramie Main Street, even though it seems to have its own agendas. I think for that reason too, we definitely should hear more from Laramie Main Street.
One final topic for this morning is in respect to public comment periods and surveys. Surveys into West Side Vision Project, stormwater drainage, traffic and safety. Regardless of what specific area, what are your thoughts with respect to the practices of gaining public input? Or as I perceive, the city of Laramie representing that they're getting input and they're involving the community. But when really, if you examine closely, example after example surface where that public input is guided or even allowed and disallowed according to the city staff agenda. Your thoughts?
Well, communication is hard nowadays. And I was just talking yesterday with a city council member about this. You put stuff out on social media and you don't reach this particular social media platform that a person is on. And they're really only on one because they don't have the bandwidth to be on multiple social media platforms. So they miss your announcement about things like stormwater drainage. The boomerang is a shadow of its former self, with one half of a reporter, and doesn't really cover a lot of things, and then tends to, when it does publish articles about local affairs, tends to publish feel-good kind of articles rather than in-depth analysis of what's going on. So we no longer have that as a common medium that we can all rely upon. There really aren't any other news sites that everybody looks at. Laramie Live, for example, published by Town Square Media, is nice, but it covers certain issues. It doesn't cover everything. Other venues, maybe more statewide ones like Wildfile, are devoted to covering the entire state, and so they really aren't that interested in micro coverage of Laramie in particular. So it's a really tough issue. And I was offering some suggestions when I talked to this council member yesterday and saying that what we really need is a staff that helps us blanket everything. We need everything from printed notices with utility bills, which is the way some people found out about the stormwater drainage issues after all of the goings on. That was the way they found it out, when they finally saw something printed. To all of the major social media platforms, to news outlets. Make sure that the news outlets actually listen and actually report on these things. To perhaps something like a blog on the city website. Why don't we have something like that? Right on the city website. Right now, the city has something called the Gem City Spark, which is a newsletter that's published now and then. It doesn't really cover all of the issues from day to day. So again, communication is hard. It's not an easy answer. But my general proposal about this is that city council should have, independent of the other city staff, independent of the city manager, should have a public relations person, should have a communications person who reports directly to them and disseminates this information directly to the public. And if not a full-time job, this person should at least be a really enthusiastic part-timer. Perhaps we can get an intern from the University of Wyoming to do this, someone who does journalism or communications there, and really get this information out there and break down the barriers. Get the information out to the public and encourage the public to respond and gather information from the public and bring it back to council. That's the only way we're going to have this sort of communication, I think. And it's a tough job, but we really need to invest in this, because otherwise our government is operating unaccountably behind the scenes. And while we'd like to ignore it, we'd like to just hope that government automatically does the right thing. Well, as you get a little older and a little more experience with things, you learn, well, no, that's not so. You really need to have constant interaction with your government to make sure that it does the right things. And that's the only way to do it.
Who would oppose voters speaking at an election on any given particular issue? Is it not the voter themselves that elected the representatives? Why would you not, as an elected representative, want, on powerfully important matters, to hear the voters on the voter roll speak as the electorate to a given issue?
Well, I suppose that if you are either bureaucratic or authoritarian, you wouldn't. If you are a bureaucrat somewhere in the government hierarchy and you want to control things, then you're not going to you're going to want to just dictate things without asking the public. If you are authoritarian, of course, then you're also going to want to dictate things. But that's not what we have, not what we supposedly have in a democracy. So we don't want either of those unsupervised sorts of control. And the only way the public can make sure that we don't, again, is to interact with government and insist on having a voice. That's why we need the elected mayor. This is why we need to comment at city council meetings. This is why, in general, we can't just be passive and hope for the best. We need to get involved.
Tomorrow night, August 5th, at 406 Ivinson Avenue in the City Hall, City Council chambers will be filled. I suspect few chairs available. And an overflow area will also be available, but you can also check out the entirety on YouTube viewing. Just Google Laramie City Council live stream, and the most current one will pop and populate to your viewing screen. Also, alternatively, within that City Council Agenda Center, you'll have an opportunity to select a Zoom option, and through hitting the HTML or PDF icons, those lines, you're able to pass through the hyperlink to those specific Zoom opportunities where you can raise your hand and be recognized by City Council remotely if you're not able to make it in person. This is the Talk Shop. Brett Glass, myself, Eric Henderson, today with a second segment brought to you by H&R Block, the UPS Store, and I-80 Towing and Automotive Services. We thank you for listening and tuning in. Bring all your topics and conversations to the Talk Shop. Let's talk. Let's listen. Let's learn. Radio works at mail.com, 307-460-3087. We appreciate your time.